Alright, today is going to be an intense video because I want to finally take a look at something that has been progressively building within the games industry for many years and might have finally hit its full-blown ignition point. Before really diving in, it's important to understand from a historical perspective why it could be so significant, and also make plain that I am going to propose certain critical thinking exercises during the video, which should be evaluated in a vacuum and not used as a lightning rod for off-platform activity or harassment of certain individuals. I don't feel like it should be necessary to state such a thing so explicitly, seeing as the primary audience for this channel is well over the age of 25 by and large, but due to the nature of the subject matter, it's worth saying. I believe that we may very well be sitting on the precipice of another Gamergate-style watershed moment in history. Gamergate, for those that don't know, was an extremely inflammatory controversy which saw the wider gaming community pitted against certain activists and journalists in the space in a series of events which forever changed media perception of the industry, as well as future policy from major corporate offices. I won't extend the discussion to the ethical or moral quagmire of what Gamergate really was, but the important thing to know is that it was, and is, viewed by different groups to have very different meanings. To some, it was a campaign of malicious harassment and bigotry meant to oust certain voices from the space entirely. To others, it was a watchdogs-type expose into the corruption of gaming journalism that had become a cesspool of quid pro quo behavior with incestuous conflicts of interest. Whatever you believe it was for today does not matter, because the immutable fact is that it changed the landscape in one devastating flashpoint, so much so that media outlets and journalists to this very day reference the movement as an ongoing negative paragon in the industry. So why does this matter? Well, the answer is rather simple. I believe we are at, or at the very least very near to, another watershed moment that rivals or outright eclipses Gamergate if it evolves further, and the results of that impending conflict, because there is an impending conflict of some kind between gaming communities and certain influential voices seeking to regulate, control, and moderate them, but the results of that conflict may once again change the landscape forever as these two groups collide. It's pretty dramatic, I know, and a lot of people will say things like, oh, stop looking for melodrama, you were being hyperbolic, etc., but I firmly believe this collision is coming because the voices on either side of the aisle, with that aisle being directly between gaming community members and embedded activists, are growing louder by the day, and it does not appear either side is willing to back down at all, so the inevitable climax will be some sort of conflict, whether it be now or later. To clarify here, because relatively harmless conflict of this kind happens on a near daily basis in the industry, I am referring to a moment like Gamergate that gets held up as a beacon to both ideological sides of what they perceive themselves to be fighting for, and galvanizes the conflict into something entirely new and much more severe. Basically, Gamergate 2.0 is coming, and I think we might be standing right at the edge looking over into the abyss. So what is the moment? Recently, Twitch unveiled a new Trust and Safety Advisory Council comprised of 8 individual experts and streamers. Most of the picks centered on advocates against cyberbullying and harassment, but one in particular drew the most attention. Ferociously Steph, a streamer who has some, to be very diplomatic here, extremely quirky personal preferences, came under scrutiny for her past comments regarding voice chat in competitive gaming and how its core functionality is anti-inclusivity. This matters, not because she is someone who draws secondary forms of criticism, though that certainly doesn't help the situation, but because augmentations to voice chat functionality, specifically in competitive gaming, which was and is her focus, marks a very clear crossover from wanting, for example, gaming narratives to include more diverse characters, which can already result in various detrimental effects to its overall experience, if done poorly, to advocating that existing, highly popular and competitive titles with millions of fans be actively changed in a way that decidedly harms the experience and destroys the current sense of competition in a likely irreconcilable way. Now, obviously, the Twitch Trust and Safety Council has little to no bearing on how the landscape of gaming evolves over time. Thinking this individual can actually implement any of this because of their newfound and altogether far too enthusiastically touted power, but that's a separate topic, thinking that this individual can do anything about such a topic is quite obviously incorrect. However, that is just the beginning. While discussing this topic with Sophia Narwitz a couple of nights ago, subsequently reading her article, which I will link down below, please go check it out, and also perusing the now crowdsourced investigation that has taken shape online, I was made aware of the fact that Ferociously Steph also has ties to the ADL, or Anti-Defamation League. The ADL is, at its absolute best, still highly controversial. The organization has drawn criticism for numerous different events, not limited to its prejudicial behavior against certain groups, despite projecting an outward-facing image of having contradictory goals. Ferociously Steph, the streamer appointed to the new Trust and Safety Committee, has a direct connection to the ADL, which descends to an as of yet unknown depth. There are photographs of her with the associate director of the ADL's Center for Technology and Society attending conventions, and there is even mention of Twitch itself in the various different posts. Taking a step back, under normal circumstances, none of this should matter at all because it's just organic overlap between two separate groups. But in recent controversial fashion, the ADL has been deliberately taking aim at video games and also major publishing platforms like Steam. Here is an article posted April 30th, 2020, discussing how Steam is harboring extremists, which aligns conspicuously with Ferociously Steph's own less than well-received statements about how a lot of you gamers are white supremacists.
I'm just not cool with white supremacy, y'all. It's really not that. I think a lot of you gamers are actually white supremacists. Sorry. Just a fact of how I feel.
What we can see is a very clear connection in both projected message and professional alignment. Ferociously Steph is linked directly to the ADL and has been questionably given a position of authority in a very skewed trust and safety panel, which clearly pertains to harassment, bullying, and extremism on the platform, demonstrated by various council member credentials, such as Emma Lanso, for example, who specializes in a number of topics including anti-terrorism and radicalizing content. Still, in an isolated space, this could be summarized as one group's rogue agenda being shouted into the void, possibly with noble intentions, admittedly, despite the track record of horrific behavior by the ADL, but nothing to be taken too seriously. However, media agencies are very quick to run with these types of sensationalist headlines about gamer prejudice. An easy example would be CNN, citing the ADL's article statistics and claiming that 74% of adults playing video games have experienced harassment in some form. Now, brushing past the immediate issue of that last disclaimer there, in some form, and how it could easily invalidate the entire premise, this is an example of mainstream news media publications running with the ADL's narrative and branding the gaming community as hostile based on the agenda of one organization. So what does this do? Well, I cannot highlight a direct causal link here, but on April 4th, 2020, EA, one of the largest publishing companies in the entire industry, created a blog post published by the PR director Martin Lorber outlining their new initiatives, Good Gaming, Well Played Democracy, and No Pixels for Fascists, which would be expanding in the country of Germany. Now, Martin Lorber has also published other blog posts with extremely subjective and personal emphasis as far back as 2014, during the epicenter of the original Gamergate controversy, which aligned directly with Anita Sarkeesian and other figures advocating that the video game space was a maliciously bigoted haven of prejudicial behavior. Here's the problem, and this next part was discovered by a user named Suitably Bored on Twitter. I will link to their profile down below in the description. When exploring the most recent Good Gaming, Well Played Democracy and No Pixels for Fascists announcement, it can be seen that the initiative will partner with the Amadeo Antonio Foundation. The Amadeo Antonio Foundation is a group that seeks to, by their own words on their site, strengthen a democratic civil society that consistently opposes right-wing extremism, racism, and anti-Semitism. Basically, EA is partnering with an activist organization in Germany to establish a broader alliance against what they perceive to be harmful behavior in their online communities. Problem is, the Amadeo Antonio Foundation is represented by Annette Kahane, who is also the chairman of the board. Why does that matter? Because Annette Kahane is an extremely well-known ex-collaborator with the German Ministry for State Security, also known as the Stasi. The Stasi, setting aside any sort of political spin here, was a state security service of the German Democratic Republic and was widely known as an effective intelligence service in charge of crushing dissident behavior. The Stasi are directly referenced as having used mass networks of informants to execute hidden psychological destruction of dissidents. They were responsible for banning pornography, then producing their own, which was aired to high-ranking military officials for the purposes of blackmail. They operated their own prison and weaponized propaganda to subdue the population. Annette Kahane, as documented by Stasi records, which were mostly a matter of public record up until the coronavirus outbreak, was a well-known informant who incriminated friends and fellow students to the agency. In 2004, during her autobiography, Kahane claimed to feel a profound sense of embarrassment and regret for her actions, but the fact remains that the German Ministry for State Security executed psychological warfare against its own population to crush dissident behavior, and a former collaborator now resides as chairman of the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, which claims to seek the strength of a better, democratic civil society while opposing right-wing extremism. This organization partners up with EA to roll out an initiative that polices their online gaming communities, right about the same time that the ADL has begun taking larger swings at the gaming space as a whole on the basis of it existing as a haven for white supremacy, and one of its direct affiliates is appointed to a Twitch Safety Council while advocating that communication be locked down in online gaming communities because it can cause harassment and is somehow anti-inclusivity. All of this leads to one simple question. What is acceptable when fighting against something that you personally perceive to be evil? EA has had certain hiccups in the past, where they banned the term white man from Battlefield 5 text chat, for example, but no other combination of a skin color, or any color for that matter, with the word man resulted in censored messages. They claimed this was an algorithmic glitch, but that is disproven when the term DLC was also banned, in all circumstances, unless you put the word free in front of it. I can only speculate as to the motivation for that one, but since Battlefield 5 would have free DLC in effect, and this was right about the time that EA was taking a lot of heat for their monetization practices, I suspect they were intent upon making sure that they controlled discourse within the game and forced users to always acknowledge that the DLC would be free or they couldn't speak about it at all. Where does the line exactly get drawn? For a group that you perceive to be hateful, however the borders of that group end up being composed, is it acceptable to create sweeping psychological programs to crush their dissident behavior? Is it necessary to destroy the fundamental communication of video games to ensure that no avenue exists for someone to have their feelings hurt? And ultimately, is it morally or ethically justified to use the very same oppression one claims to fight against to, in turn, oppress those that they feel have wronged them, or whose very existence they believe intrinsically threatens others? What we see right now in the video game industry is an escalating attempt at controlling discourse by large companies, activist groups, and media publications. I am not here to tell you whether or not their initiatives are by default moral or immoral, but when you have an underlying community that starts to become aware of increasingly aggressive control measures being taken over them, it is highly probable that their animosity will only increase rather than dissipate, and eventually a single incendiary event will spark off a conflict, much like Gamergate, that had been building for years in preparation. I believe that the Twitch Safety Advisory Council has torn back the curtain for many video game players and viewers to a point where they are consciously aware of the forces in play now. That's not to say that many didn't already know, but the heightened scrutiny, the tracing of ties, and the overall atmosphere of outrage is creating a storm of awareness that, as I said earlier, could easily serve as a catalyst which sparks a feedback loop of media and activist action and reaction, playing off the pent-up frustration that many gamers feel. Basically, the media goes after the game players go after the media, and it just kind of spirals out of control back and forth. That frustration is found when they are blanketly referred to as white supremacists, when media outlets routinely categorize them as misogynistic in really blanket fashion, or when statistics about how awful, problematic, and abusive the video game communities have become are projected to a wider audience as if it represents the entire space, without understanding that the actual demographic majority in play here are not that and do not feel that way. These recent events might very well become a watershed moment to the tune of Gamergate level reactions. It's not guaranteed, but it's definitely possible. And if true, it would once again reshape the industry for years to come, as various companies and groups use it to either advance their own existing agendas or decry their adversaries. And the sad reality is that the gaming industry, far more than it ever should be, has turned into a battleground of psychological control. That's it for today, though. I hope it ends up being nothing. Honestly, I do, but we'll see. If you want to support, there are links down below. Merch, Patreon, Twitter, another gaming YouTuber to support as well. Please go check out his channel, AxialGT, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.